because God could have told Abraham, hey, why are you listening to Sarah for? Tell her to get her act together, and you're going to be a family. After all, that's the idealism. But no, that's not what we see God do. He comes in as a judge, and he basically looks at this mess, and he goes, you know what? It's not going to work out. Almost like he understands the humanness of things, and he goes, all right, Hagar and Ishmael, you guys need to go that way, and I'll bless you, and you guys. And frankly, Ishmael would not be counted anyway as.
Hey, before we jump into the podcast, we want to thank all our donors and supporters who make the Today Count show possible. It's through your generosity that we're able to shape leaders through this content and this podcast. And be sure to like, subscribe, and follow wherever you find yourself coming across this content. All right, let's get to the podcast.
Hey, Pastor Matt and Pastor Winston, glad that you are joining me today on the Today Count show as we continue our discussions in the book of Genesis, which we have endeared the title at some point in this process as the Genesis Project. And it's been a little bit, I think, since we have dived in. We find ourselves in Genesis 21, but good afternoon to you guys.
Good afternoon.
Yes. Glad to be here as always.
Yes.
Be fun.
We always try to make these podcasts evergreen, but it's difficult for me to just do business as usual without acknowledging that there was an assassination today. I believe today's the 10th of September, if I'm right. And Charlie Kirk was shot and killed in Utah at a gathering. He was a political activist, and I know that he was very much known by younger, the younger generation for sure. He was speaking their language, kind of had a posture that invited discussion from all walks of life, and it's just a sad thing. Turning our attention today to Genesis 21, we go back in history, and we're revisiting. And I don't mean this in a condemning way, because there's probably plenty of blame to go around for all of us. But we are visiting a patriarch's family, and even the patriarchs had amazing dysfunction. And just to catch everybody up, God promised a baby to Abram and his wife Sarai, and they concocted their own idea of how that was going to happen, stepped outside of the faith and trust in God, did their own thing, and which we'll kind of revisit here in a minute. Time has gone by, and then as God promised, he did bring a child into their life. I think most people of that day, and probably us looking back in time, would call it a miracle, for sure. And so this other boy is born, and now we have more tension in the family. There's a lot to learn from in this text, and there are speculations of all kinds that sometimes go outside what the scripture teaches, but I wouldn't be surprised if that comes up in our discussion. So I'm picking up in Genesis 21, reading out the New Living Translation, only because it does some of the commentating for us. It is an idiomatic translation, meaning it's not word for word, but it is phrase by phrase, thought by thought. So it says this: the Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened at just the time God had said it would. Remember, guys, the Lord and a couple of angels had made a physical visit to Abraham, and there was discussion about this. In verse 3, it says, Abraham named their son Isaac. 8 days after Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And Sarah declared, God has brought me laughter. All who hear about this will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby? Yet I have given Abraham a son in his old age. I like that phraseology there. I have given Abraham a son. You can sense the pride and joy of that event. Verse 8 says, when Isaac grew up and was about to be weaned, we don't know exactly when that was. We don't know if that was, 6 months, 9 months. We don't know if it was 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Some even say a year. But anyway, when Isaac grew up and was about to be weaned, Abraham prepared a huge feast to celebrate the occasion. But Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Abraham, and her Egyptian servant Hagar, making fun of her son Isaac. So she turned to Abraham and demanded, get rid of that slave woman. Now, technically, this is a wife. Get rid of that slave woman and her son. He is not going to share the inheritance with my son, Isaac. I won't have it. I think there's some license there in modern language. Verse 11. This upset Abraham very much because Ishmael was his son. But God told Abraham, do not be upset. Do not be upset over the boy and your servant. Interesting that God's language was very similar to Sarah's language. Do whatever Sarah tells you, for Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. But I will also make a nation of the descendants of Hagar's son, because he is your son too. So Abraham got up early the next morning, prepared food and a container of water, and strapped them on Hagar's shoulders. Then he sent her away with their son, and she wandered aimlessly in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water was gone, she put the boy in the shade of a bush. Then she went and sat down by herself about 100 yards away. I don't want to watch the boy die, she said, and she burst into tears. But God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. Hagar, what's wrong? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Go to him and comfort him, for I will make a great nation from his descendants. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well full of water. She quickly filled her water container and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy as he grew up in the wilderness. He became a skillful archer, and he settled in the wilderness of Paran. His mother arranged for him to marry a woman from the land of Egypt.
A lot going on here.
Yeah, there really is.
A lot going on.
I mean, I could have stopped on every other phrase, and made a
so much
comment.
Yeah, one of the things that early on jumps out to me, that's always jumped out to me about this story is, the idea of laughter. Specifically in verse 6, God has brought me laughter. So just that idea too, that, how often do we think about, God bringing us laughter? I mean, even we talk about joy, but even just the idea of like laughter itself, comedy, that kind of thing. But Genesis 18:12, it says, so Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I'm worn out, my Lord is old. Will I now have this pleasure? Like, she laughed about the idea of having this promise, and now she's laughing in a different context. She's laughing at the reality that this came to pass. And I just think about those, dualities, right? When we are often presented with these impossible scenarios, and it's almost laughable. Like, how could God do this specific thing? How could I ever, experience anything different than I'm currently living? And then just like God to show up and something happen, and it's like, this is a reality. That something happened that I didn't think could ever happen, and I'm doing the same thing, but it means something different now. Like, and just the power of laughter. Laughter can be sarcastic, it can be dismissive, or it can be a celebratory acceptance of this beautiful reality. So I just think in that context, like, laughing is just such an interesting topic even that arises here.
Yeah, I love the language at the opening of this, because it's in the, I think I'm reading this one out of the NIV, and I always keep my ESV too. But the Lord was gracious to Sarah, and He did for Sarah what He had promised. And I think there's times that we get into our own thought process of what we think should happen, or obviously we see this whole thing have played out. They tried it their own way, and Hagar and Ishmael, but it is what God has promised. Because there's obviously some disobedience here. There's let's try to figure it out another way, but it reminds us again what God has said, what God has ordained, that the sovereignty of God, that doesn't give us a license to go run off the rails and it's going to happen anyway. But it should give us a license to look back the other way and say, man, what would happen if we just trusted a little more? Like let the proof of God be what pushes us forward in trusting Him. And sometimes we fail to do that. There's so many things. I'm with you, Jim. There's so many, like every other phrase you could just stop and because this is 25 years after the promise.
Yeah.
I mean, we're like a minute or two's gone by. Like there's been some,
Mm-hmm.
there's been plenty of time.
Yeah, because he got the promise around 80, right? I think that's somewhere around.
Yeah, so about 25 years is gone, and so I don't know. I just there's so much packed in all of this on the front end of it, and I love what you said about the laughter. That's exactly right. And so it's
I want to throw my 2 cents in about the laughter too, because when good things have happened in my life, whether I immediately attributed it to God's hand or just in general, I do remember giggles kind of coming out. Good things, amazing things that happen to you. I'll get this is not nearly spiritual, I don't think, but last night I was laying on the couch sucking on some throat lozenges and watching the Tigers and the Yankees. And no offense to those listening who are Yankee fans, but I can honestly say I very much dislike the Yankees, and I would use a different word. But I don't know if you guys saw it, but I've got this small market Detroit Tiger fan that I am, and they're playing the Yankees, and the wheels came off with the Yankees, and it was just, and they were just walking guys in, right? And I just laid on the couch giggling. I was having so much fun watching the Yankees beat themselves. So the Tigers literally just stood there with a bat in their hand, and for the most part didn't swing, and the runs just kept coming in. Final score, it was 2-2 when I picked up the game, and the game ended at 12-2.
It's unfortunate you're also a Detroit Lions fan.
True.
The only thing you have going for you is the University of Michigan on occasion.
On occasion, yeah.
Yeah. It's your Tiger days, man. Y'all had some glory days back in '87, but other than that,
that's so true.
Whenever,
yeah, so true. I think, I think when we've talked about this the last 2 or 3 episodes, but once again, we see God staying true to what he said, and to in agreement to what you were saying, Matt, earlier, living sloppy, making mistakes. God is even sovereign, over those things. And here we see God doing 2 things at the same time. Again, one is he's doing what he said he was what he would do. And the other thing he's doing is he's redeeming something that, was bad. When you read this text out of one of the more literal translations, and then I read it out of this NLT, and I'm watching what the scholars do with this NLT, trying to smooth out the story, because with the more literal translations, it's kind of rough. There's all kinds of jagged edges that don't make sense. I mean, for example, it says that when Hagar left, Abraham put Ishmael on her back, and I'm doing the math, going, well, wait a second, Hagar had to be like a teenager, I mean, Ishmael had to be like a teenager. So, that's weird. And but then when you read the NLT, they don't interpret it, that way. It was more of a figure of speech, I think is the best you can do on a literal translation. But I did notice that he got up early in the morning. Now, maybe Abraham got up early in the morning. Maybe that was just his deal. But I think there's more to it. I think that, this was a big deal. Can you imagine the gossip going on in this clan where, you have now a woman, Hagar, who becomes a wife of Abraham, gives birth, and literally is grafted into the family and is kind of a big deal.
Well, and it, the spiritual parallels here as well with, hey, Ishmael being, considered the son of the flesh, or, the backup plan. And, we see the spiritual fight already between the son of promise and, the son of, of my fleshly desire to help God out. So we see him, scoffing already at Isaac. I think the language is there for it to say that, the son of the flesh was scoffing at the son of the promise, and just that spiritual war that goes on, because we can, as we've talked about in length, the Bible is so layered with so much depth. You don't have to stretch a scripture. Sometimes you shouldn't stretch any scriptures very far, but I'm just saying you shouldn't have to stretch it to see the parallels of what's happening here, of Abraham living in the consequences of his decisions. And while I think this kind of goes back a little bit, Jim, to what I said earlier, while God is sovereign and God's plan was fulfilled, it was complicated, and they did have to live, and we still today are living in the consequences of the bad decisions, even though the sovereignty of God was played out. The son of promise was born. The lineage did go through him. Isaac did accomplish, of what God had intended through Abraham, but there were still consequences to the other bad decisions. So I think that's probably what I was trying to say earlier. Even though the sovereignty of God is going to happen, we can make it a little bit muddy with our bad decisions.
What encourages me is it, and I'd like to see how you guys respond to this. What encourages me is that what I see here is that God is willing to get involved in the complicated matters of our lives, and in some ways, God is more practical than we are. In other words, my idealism says, well, why can't we just all get along? Why can't we just, okay, we made a mistake, but we're one big family. But if you read the text, it seems pretty clear that because God could have told Abraham, hey, why are you listening to Sarah for? Tell her to get her act together, and you're going to be a family. After all, that's the idealism. But no, that's not what we see God do. He comes in as a judge, and he basically looks at this mess and he goes, you know what? It's not going to work out. Almost like he understands the humanness of things. And he goes, all right, Hagar and Ishmael, you guys need to go that way. And, I'll bless you. And you guys, and frankly, Ishmael would not be counted anyway as one of the sons of the blessing. I mean, so in a weird way, I'd like to get you guys' response on this. I'm going, wow, because for me, I can be so idealistic where, when I read the Bible, then it should look like this. It should be heaven on earth. But this is not heaven on earth. And God seems to understand that better than I do.
It's really good. That's really good. Yeah, I feel like Pastor Matt and I were talking about this in a similar context with like maybe certain views on church and how church is supposed to respond to social matters. And Pastor Matt, can you share what you shared with me about the content you came across about, like what is the church doing for the
Oh
community?
yeah. So I heard a pastor. He said he was asked. This fits into what you were saying, Jim, a little bit. And they said they asked the pastor. They said, "What does your church do for the community?" And he said, I paused for a second. I looked back at him and I said, "Church." And that was the pastor's response. And he said his point was, he went on to elaborate what the point was. He said, because you can change their meal or their diet for one day with some food. You can change their attire for a couple weeks or months with some clothes. He said, but what happens when a family or a single mom or a kid or whatever situation walks through the doors of the church? They meet Jesus, they grow and they begin to grow in their faith, they begin to mature in their faith, and they become a Christ follower. Then the community gets better. Then the community changes because of what they experienced at church. And just sometimes we get in this idealism of just I love the way you put it. I'm not gonna repeat it. I love the way that you put that, though, because it's but God has a way. I was while you were saying this, and I'll let Winston jump back in just a minute, but as you were saying this about, let's all just be one big happy family. God in his sovereignty was looking ahead, in to present day, to end of time, and would know that it would still be that Israeli Palestinian conflict, which would be the things that would drive the world into chaos while others are screaming peace, peace, peace. The world's going to dive into chaos because of that, and it comes out of this arrangement of stepbrothers right here. And so I'm with you, Jim. Ideally, come on, guys, let's get along. Let's just be happy. Like it's not that big of a deal. Like, calm down, quit getting your feelings hurt, quit. But in God's sovereignty, it's also going to be the thing that drives to the perfect place of a new heaven, a new earth, and a place called heaven. So.
Yeah, I think the idealism that you're talking about, Jim, that we all, I think, gravitate towards in the face of conflict is a way of avoidance that we don't want to call it that. And so idealism feels like a good answer or a good response to chaos or to disorder or to conflict. But I feel like this is God modeling conflict resolution. There's clear boundaries, there's clear direction. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like the Disney story and everybody, gets along and everybody gets what they want. But it's necessary for what must happen and how everything must transpire and go forward. And so I think, this story and scripture is constantly challenging our idealism, because we often have to ask, where is our idealism originating from? And it's originating from the fact that, we don't want to do the hard things. Abraham, you could feel the tension in the story. Abraham is like, like I think it said
he was distressed.
He was distressed.
Verse 11. He was distressed. Yeah.
And so, what happens when we get distressed? All right, let's figure out what's the shortcut to make all of this work versus, okay, what's going to be the long road to everybody's, well-being, if you will. Like what's the entire picture? And of course, Abraham can't see the entire picture. Only God can. And so we often, in our feelings, in our fear of rejection or whatever
our own insecurities,
we just shortcut it. Yeah. And we lean into that idealism and avoid what needs to happen. There have been seasons in my life where I've looked back and I thought, what was that even about? Did I grow in that season? Did I get better? Am I still stuck in that season? If you have similar thoughts, I want to introduce you to a book called Story, The Art of Learning from Your Past. This book, written by Jim Piper, shares principles and stories that actually help us get unstuck and step into the future we've always wanted. Be sure to stop by leadtodaycommunity.com to grab your copy today.
Yeah, boy, we're really tapping on something here that I don't think the three of us realized we were going to talk about. But now I'll take it even a step further. But you guys have already kind of laid the carpet out for me when Matt threw in the term insecurity, and you and you, Winston, talked about avoidance, I just had the thought, come over me that, oh, you know, I, for those of us who don't like to fail, if we don't grapple, if we don't hold on to the idealism, then that means I've got to live with failure. That, I'm part of this. I've caused this.
Yeah.
I've been, I was at least part of causing this. I read something today, when I was studying, that was so simple, but you know how like you can read a sentence and you go, oh, that's so true. And I don't know if it fits this context exactly right, but I was reading about mindsets, and I was on a section about relationships, and it said that, the problem with the problem with relationships, the challenge with relationships is that there's you, there's your partner. So you kind of know where they're going there, right? There's you got your stuff, your partner, they have their stuff, but then there's the relationship. So there's three dynamics before you even bring all those three things together. And no wonder they are, relationships are difficult. And it's a book that I was reading and doing some research that was just talking about, and where you triggered, Winston, you're the one that triggered this, it was talking about how people with a fixed mindset, they run out of relationships because they conclude that, well, we're just not a good fit. And really, when you do the work, it's no, we don't want to do the work. That's what it is. We don't want to confront what we need to confront. And that might, be a bigger, part of this. There's another thing I'm going to throw out here. So when God was consoling Abraham and telling Abraham, hey, look, do what Sarah said, get them out of the camp, and because I'm going to make him a great nation anyway. Well, apparently he didn't tell Hagar that, because as you recall, once they were kaput, they were, so I see this teenager who a lot of times the will of a teenager will fall way short of a mother. Even if he's physically stronger, he's emotionally typically weaker. And so I'm kind of seeing them wandering through the desert, and he's doing the teenage thing, and she realizes he ain't got what it takes to get, to keep going on. And what is she going to do? She can't carry him. So they kind of collapse together under the bush. Then she gets herself up to separate herself emotionally from the situation. Sits there, and then God speaks to her and says the same thing to her that he said to Abraham. So I asked myself, why didn't Abraham give him some hope? Did he forget? Did he wonder about it? And, like some men do, it just gets stuck in the noggin, doesn't come out the mouth? Or was that all part of God's plan anyway, where he wanted Hagar to hear it from him at this most desperate time? I don't know, but as you guys know, my mind goes and I wonder, about those kinds of things. What do you think?
Your mind wandering is the best part of this conversation. Always.
Well, you should see my Bible. I'm circling those, and I have a line to it, and I'm going, what the? I guess men's communication wasn't any better back then than it is today. And then, of course, God opens Hagar's eyes. It doesn't say God dropped in a well. It said that he opened her eyes so that she could see the well. So there was already a well there. That's how I read it. And, Winston, you said in an episode ago or two or three, you talked about how desperation, how did you say it? Desperation leads us. Desperation drives us. And I always find it interesting that we can be in the presence of a savior. We can be in the presence of a friend. We can be in the presence of help. We can be in the presence of answers. But if we're in the wrong state, we don't see it. We can't see it. I wonder how many times that's happened in my life.
In that vein, I was recently talking to a friend, and we were just talking about the idea of how, unaddressed pain, and it doesn't have to be major traumatic pain, but you just take a nick here and there, and it just kind of stacks, and it just lulls you to sleep, and you just start becoming unaware of things you should be aware of, right? The well is right there, but I'm really thirsty because I'm so distracted, or I'm so discouraged, or by what's going on, and my attention's taken away, and so it's just it's subtle. It's a slow drift, and I wonder even about Abraham, if he was so kind of just distraught about the whole thing, that major detail about hey, if this is of any encouragement, your son is also going to be a great nation. It just wasn't front of mind. He was trying to process, what does this dynamic look like, or how do I even sever this relationship, like all of the human dynamics that would go into this. I mean, he's given up his idea, if you will. Like this was his plan. This was his answer to the promise, which I also kind of thought, in a separate train of thought, interesting, was he didn't do all of this out of his own volition of wanting to be the father of many nations. God called him to that, and then his response to that was this. So it was with good intentions. He was trying to help God, but even his good intentions were terrible. Like his good effort, his good try led to pure chaos and dysfunction. And so how many times do we try to justify our decisions with, well, I was just trying to do the best that I could, right? And it's like that you can't justify your disobedience, or you can't justify a poor decision with good intentions. And so many of us try to put our hat on good intentions, and good intentions don't help anybody.
I kind of softened, as I meditated on this text, I kind of softened in the beginning, I felt a tension towards Sarah, right? I mean, I tried to go into the story. I tried to be one of them, right? I even imagined myself in the camp when I'm reading the text. When I see Sarah complaining, when I first read through it, or the first 10 times or 100 times, however many times, I mean, for years in my life, I've never viewed Sarah well. I haven't. But it wasn't until recently that I thought, wait a second. Let's bring this back to the marketplace. I hire somebody and I like them, and I think they can help the team. But as time goes by, they do some things, they become something that I don't like anymore. The text does kind of give you a bit of, not just this text, but in the previous text, it gives you a sense that Hagar was getting a little sloppy and sassy in her posture. And now the older half brother is picking on the little brother. Okay. There's probably more to it.
Maybe repeating something he had already heard at home.
Yeah. And I already chuckled about it earlier. I love how the NLT committee picked this term. I won't have it. I think I remember my grandmother saying that. I won't have it. And again, so for me, it's like, Jim, you're such a perfectionist. You think everything needs to be engineered perfectly, and then everyone should get along, and everyone should forgive, and we should be able to do this in this world that is filled with sin and jealousy and all these, sins and weaknesses. We don't feel good sometimes. I've been struggling the last few days, and you're just not yourself. As a human being, you start getting the sniffles, you start getting this and that, and you're not yourself. You're not as productive. And that's the weakness part. And then you got the sinful part. You put all that together, and how in the world do I come up with these utopias in my head? holding out. But I don't know. That's kind of where I land. The biggest on this story is that I need to be paying attention to God's wisdom as I consider the dream, the idealism, the fairy tale. Not want to give up on that all the time. But there is practical wisdom that apparently is godly in the midst of all this stuff.
I think to your point, we often don't associate wisdom with tension, and we try to categorize wisdom in the umbrella of idealism. And the way that I kind of see it is idealism is one end of the spectrum, and then fatalism is the other end of the spectrum, and both cause us to abdicate the responsibility of living in the tension of wisdom. And so it's this is that, like, there's the opportunity to be, super idealistic and opportunistic and think, this could all work out, or you could take it the whole other way and just scratch the whole thing. God can't use this. None of this is going to work, versus, it's going to work, but it's not going to work the way you think it is. And we're going to walk out the consequences of your decisions as well.
Yeah, I'm bouncing around the story and the range of emotion that is just simply in the story.
Yeah.
I mean, we go from God has promised, God has said, God is sovereign, laughter, to a mother that's put her boy over to the side because she can't stand to watch him die from, lack of water. And there's just, there's disagreement in this story. There's, again, all these underlying issues that we've kind of talked through a little bit. And in the midst of all of that is still God showing up and speaking, God showing up and hearing the cry of a boy. That's interesting that he did. Bible's twice, the stories twice says that God heard the boy crying. Where did it come back to? Oh, it says, "Do not be afraid." God has heard the boy crying as he lies here. So just reiterates twice, even though we don't understand it, has a plan, and you're like, how's this going to work out? God was with the boy as he grew up. I mean, what kind of? We wouldn't have written the story that way. That's just not how, our idealism, either our idealism would have written the story that, God was with all of them as they grew up together. Our fatalist side would have written the story of, Hagar and the boy went out there and died, and it was the end of the story, or something with Abraham, something with Isaac. We would have written it a totally different way. And God's like, no, there's another path here that not of. And then you got to trust me.
It's interesting how we can read a story and we're these commentators sitting in the bleachers. And then when Matt, you go through something, I can say to myself, well, he just needs to do this, and this. And Winston, when you go through something, you just need to do this, and this. But when I go through something, it's a crisis of faith, crisis of belief. It is, and you guys are thinking, yeah, Jim just needs to do this, this.
You need three things, he'd be good.
Right. Yeah, it's always three things too, right? It's always got to do those three things. That's at least what I teach. It's always three things. Four is too many to remember.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. I can't help but go to where I'm excited about going in our Genesis project to the, seeing the patriarchs laid out, and I see, that whole thing with Joseph. And Matt, while you were speaking, thought to myself, you were saying, well, we wouldn't write it that way. We wouldn't write it that way. Yeah, you're right. I would not write, I'm going way ahead of us, but I would not write a story about a spoiled boy who gets mistreated, a spoiled and favored boy who gets mistreated by his older siblings, thrown in a pit, sold out to slavery, and just the way. And then, of course, as you guys know, as you read through the story, even all these bad things that happened to Joseph, there's that little tagline, but God's hand was on him, but God's hand was on him, but God's hand was on him, but God's hand was on him. And there's no coincidence about it all. So it's again, how does God do that? How does he lean in and look at this mess and then start moving the chess pieces to accomplish what he was going to accomplish from the beginning? It blows me away. And what I was trying to say, and then unless you guys have anything else, we'll draw this one to a close. What I was trying to say is it's easy to read this text and say, you guys did this because you didn't have any faith. It's easy for me to look at Winston's Matt's trouble, and say this about you. It's easier for you guys to say that about me. But it really is, we're supposed to be doing this so that maybe we can pass some tests. Maybe we can pass some faith tests. Even some would be better than none. And that's kind of where my prayer went. Because I shared with somebody, in our community just a week ago, because, this person was saying that they feel like they were failing in some tests that they were going through. And it just triggered my mind about the big ones in my life. And I had to confess. I said, if anybody knew that story, they probably wouldn't want to write about it. And if somebody knew that story, and so I told this person, I said, yeah, if you put, say, the top 5 challenges in my life on a report card, I'm afraid I'd get straight Fs. That's just the truth. So when I come out of those, am I better? That's what I hope. That's what I hope. And when I do pass a test, I passed a little one, I think, yesterday. It started on Monday, and it really was a little one. But because of how I was feeling physically, I really had to, dig down deep. And I'm not just talking about my flesh. I'm talking about faith. There was something I needed to do by faith. And compared to those other 5 or 7 things I was referring to, it really was small. But you look for those kinds of base hits. It's kind of like the idealism in baseball. I'm watching my team, and idealism says everybody gets up and hits a home run. Everybody gets up and hits a home run, but my favorite guys strike out. And then we have bases loaded and no outs. Surely we will get a run in. But sometimes that doesn't happen. And so, that's why you have to learn to play small ball and not just swing for the fences. And I kind of relate that to life. If we can acknowledge our failures, that's a starting point. But if we can also recognize that we're human, that's a humbling thing, and maybe sets us up for some wins, when we're able to walk with God in such a way. Appreciate you guys very much. We're going to be continuing the story here soon. And for those of you listening, if you're enjoying this walking, talking, thinking through the book of Genesis, tell a friend.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us on the Today Counts show. We got so much more planned for you. So stay tuned and stay connected on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. And remember, today counts.